So thank you for having us.
Thank you. So RaShall, why don't you start with the perspective of the police officer?
So thank you. I'm going to share my screen with those of you. And of course, I am not an AV tech person, so give me a second as I pull up, one moment, as I pull up my presentation. I'm glad that they did not, as you can see, I was still doing other things before I was doing this, so I apologize completely and totally.
RaShall is a busy person.
I was actually on with the American Federation of Scientists as we start talking about ethical surveillance as part of a project that we are doing here in Charlottesville. So the first thing I want to talk to you about is literally as we think about the rhetoric about implicit bias and training and what we can do to disrupt some of the trajectories about implicit bias and how we introduce individuals into the criminal legal system as we move away from language like criminal justice system, as we know it is not adequate enough to describe the interactions between those who are introduced into the system and those who are moved through the system much more generically. So there have been calls and cries of how do you disrupt the system? How do you reframe the culture, particularly of implicit bias in law enforcement? And what I tell people all the time is you have to begin at the beginning. I listened into the last portion of the speakers, and they were talking about the historical perspective of policing and the foundational bedrocks of policing started in slave patrols, started with black codes. And when you build a system on supremacy and when you build a system who is functioning exactly the way that it was intended to function, you find yourself reinforcing right from the beginning the type of individuals that you would want to participate in the system. And the first part of it starts with recruiting and who is recruited into the system to start with. Policing now has 18,000 policing entities with more than 800,000 officers. Of those 800,000 officers, 80% are white male. They naturally are included or interested in the profession. It is something that is a generational profession that you don't often see in Black and brown communities. What's so interesting about it is we talk about recruitment and hiring. We think that you need to hire more minority officers, more Black officers, Latinx, those persons who are multi-ethnic, and as a way to disrupt the system. And unfortunately, I'm here to tell you that, and we'll talk about it a little bit later, hiring more Black officers will not change the racialized nature and culture of policing. It is not enough to just introduce a small number of individuals into the culture and think that that might change the racialized profile of it. And that goes against recommendations for the 21st Century Policing Task Force that was formed under President Obama as to what you could do to restore legitimacy in the policing community. However, I'm trying to think about this much more differently and in a different approach. And what do our hiring and our screening and assessment tools look like when you do have candidates? And then how do you recruit those candidates particularly? For instance, when we talk about recruitment, we often follow a business model for recruitment in any of the fields or any of the professions. And we do that by going to job fairs prior to COVID. We may look at Indeed and all the other hiring profiles, LinkedIn that we want to use. And we're finding out these are not the tools that you recruit somebody who might be able to influence our culture. Our
Excuse
screening
me,
tool,
Dr. Brackney. I'm
yes,
sorry to interrupt.
you can interrupt.
This is the host. So are you trying to share your screen right now?
I thought my screen was shared.
No, it's not shared. So you just have to hit the little green button at the bottom of your screen that says, there you go.
I got it.
Okay, I thought I had it shared up until that point, and now I have lost everything else. Wait, let's go here. All right, perfect. Back again. Are we in?
So
This
I
is
just
why I
shared.
have Teams. You have my screen shared. Someone else just popped up their screen as well. That is not mine.
I think that was Bianca's screen. So if you'd like to share your screen, just open up the document in the back, whether it's a PowerPoint or a
I
Keynote.
did. Are we there?
There you go.
I
And then you
thought
can
we
just go into
had
presentation mode.
got it. It's for some reason. Give me 1 second and we'll get there as we continue to talk through the entire process. But as we talk about the hiring and assessment and screening tools, we use traditional 1950s screening and assessment tools. I'm going to do this from current slide. Are you there? Are we able to share fully now?
You're good to go.
Perfect, thank you. When we talk about our screening and assessment tools were created in the 1950s. Standardized police tests, standardized written tests that do not help us to do things like screen out for bias, do not allow us to screen out for when those individuals may have some tendencies towards or lacking of empathy. We don't use emotional intelligence screening. Our backgrounds do not allow for those kinds of things. And we have failed to use best practices like partnering with academia to help us with those types of tools and practices. Our academies are still structured around the 1950s, where the majority of the tools, the lesson plans are heavily on arrest, heavily focused on interdictions, heavily focused on written exams, and not a lot of practicing in scenarios. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in the presentation. The way that you have tools in which you can rebut and staying with your theme, implicit bias, is understanding the police culture. The police culture is a very unique and different culture, much like any other culture. It is definitely shaped by their interactions on a daily basis. It is shaped by the work environment. I alluded to the fact that there are 800,000 policing entities and that there are more than 80% white male. That does shape an environment when you are part of a patriarchal system that was built on supremacy, and how you will act within those systems. What that has created then is procedural policing. Procedural policing is based on pretext stops. It's based on all these law and order philosophies, and it is not based on what is actually producing safety. Healthy communities are communities in which you can, the people that you are serving can thrive in those. In order to get us from where we are today to a more just system, we have to focus on procedural justice in policing, or a way in which we have the legal authorities of the police recognized. That is only created by, as I say, renegotiating the social contract that we have with our communities that we serve. We currently have a legal contract that is set up by laws and statutes and the Constitution, but we have not accounted for those nuanced ways in which we interact, so that there is a willingness by the community to obey those laws. We think that these zero tolerance strict laws that are on the books are what reduce crime rates. They've never been proven to reduce a single crime rate at this point. What has reduced your crime rates are the communities' agreed upon philosophies as to what is safety and security and how they want to be policed. Unfortunately, even that is looked through the lens of the officer, where there is a unique culture that they're going to be a part of, that we're going to have to try to disrupt. There's something that's basically the blue socialization of officers. In other words, that I may come in with one way. I come in with my own set of values, my own cultural norms, my own nuanced way in which I look at life. My lived and shared experiences will shape that. But then I'm introduced and indoctrinated into a system that does everything to strip me away from that identity, to then make me uniform. Thus, the wearing of the uniform creates that culture, helps reinforce those biases. There's nothing unique that allows me to bring my perspective to that situation. It doesn't allow me to account for the fact that I am influenced by the fact that my husband is a Black male from Mississippi that went to an HBCU that stands 6'2", that is a professor, but when officers see him, all they see is a Black man who is a threat to them. And it's often based on the blue socialization and identity of what is a threat and what is a threat to an officer's safety. So unfortunately, regardless of the number of individuals that we introduce into our system, the simple demographically diversifying the police force is not going to solve the problem of the powerful organizational culture that has been in existence for more than 400 years. So that's what we're attempting to do, change that identity and that culture. Approach to doing that and to giving some tools is to work when our cognitive schemas. And what are our schemas? Our schemas are the way in which we view things, the way we notice things, the way we interpret that information. And in policing, it's no different. The things that we look at, the things that influence the way we police in this community have all been created through systems. The lesson plans, the curriculum, the pedagogy, how it is introduced into the training, the hiring practices, the lack of representation coupled with the training, and when I say lack of representation of those who are affected persons are never part of the training curriculums, are never part of the training formulas or any of the academies. This is a strict lesson plan development that is based on reinforcing data that is also data that is self-created by some of the preconceived notions of policing. It's built on confirmation bias that started as early as the 1800s when we were gathering data about who is a threat and how they are a threat. And these confirmation biases influence everything that is occurring in policing. And for an example, if an officer holds the idea based on their training or their own implicit bias that Black communities are not safe, Black communities have higher risk of violence, that Black males are more likely to commit homicides, when the media also then presents that picture as well. Every time they encounter a person, they're going to look at it through that lens, and then they place this greater importance on confirming the evidence that they see that supports their ideas that then support their beliefs. The impact of that, unfortunately, is that confirmation bias is that we then start to create laws policing patrol patterns, surveillance that goes on in communities, arrests are at higher levels, zero tolerance policies are put into place, and they are no longer supported by objective facts. In fact, we start creating the data that then becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy based on these cognitive schemas that are introduced on multiple levels, and they continue to be folded in and scaffolded into policing structures.
Dr. Brackney, 5 minutes.
Got you. This is my last one. So how do you find it? So Kristine is putting me on the timer. So how do you do this? I'm suggesting that you do this in a very different and unique way that we may not have ever considered in policing and changing police culture, in disrupting and deconstructing police culture. One, go at it like it would any other issue in which there is a cognitive behavioral component to this. We may need to create all of our scenarios, our trainings, and reframings of our interactions through the same principles and concepts of changing a culture as you would any other behavior. I recommend that when we look at our policies and our practices, do we do those in a way in which we provide opportunities for officers to engage in safe spaces? One of the recommendations is, do we provide opportunities to review the body-worn camera videos in those interactions in a safe space? reviewing them much like you would if any of you were out there sports fans. Look at your football analogies. Before we play another team, I'm from Pittsburgh. Shout out Steelers, 8-0, only undefeated in the nation. I have to bring that in as my cultural influence. But when we look at football, we review tapes all the time to look what our performance looks like. We then study what we did well, and then we practice to overcome those areas where we have deficits. There are no types of places that currently offer the type of training and practice scenarios that you could get to start to identify, recognize biases, and to disrupt them and to change the culture, except to use some of the therapies and approaches from a public health perspective that you would with any other bias or behavior that you were attempting to change. So with that, I will hand that over, hopefully under time, to my counterpart as
Certainly
well.
have a few more minutes if there's something more you'd like to add.
No, the only thing I want to add, and this is really important, there is no amount of therapy or group training that can effectively address our racism in this country. Angela Davis said that long before. We must dismantle the structures of racism. And what I loved about the previous speaker is that we need to go from to move towards a rectifying these systems. And the way to rectify them is to completely often dismantle them and then create the foundation that are built on the healthy, striving, equitable, just foundations that every American, particularly our Black and Brown communities who've been so disadvantaged, have operated under for decades, centuries. So thank you.
So I'm just going to share my screen. I think I can do that.
And then I will stop sharing mine.
Thank you. So we've heard such important information that everyone needs to know who's in the criminal justice system, and some live it personally and some are learning it with greater urgency now, but either way, it's so important for us to know. What I want to talk about are the things that we can do today. It's easy to maybe be despairing and feel that the issues are so great and how can we make a difference? And a number of people have talked about the role of the prosecutor. And I personally believe that the prosecutor has a big role in being able to make a difference, whether there's legislation or anything else helping them, they can do it on their own. So I want to quickly talk about just 3 areas where any prosecutor in any place can make a difference today. And hopefully we'll do that tomorrow when you go back to the office. So I just have to, sorry. So the first step, I think, or all of these could be parallel steps actually, is to look inside your own office. And we've seen many prosecutor offices that are starting to do an internal review of their staff and simply asking, how are you doing? And this is for all staff, lawyers and non-lawyers of any race, creed, or color, and just ask how people are doing. This is a difficult time. We have the pandemic. We have the concerns and understanding about the issues that have been raised by the murder of George Floyd, and simply doing something as human as asking how you're doing. We've seen offices create diversity positions, someone who's in charge of being a diversity officer who can lead discussions around that question. Offices are creating committees of people, both lawyers and non-lawyers, to review how things are working within the office. What are procedures like where people get hired or promoted? How are people feeling about the various processes that are going on in an office? Of course, implicit bias training, much like today, is a step, but it's only a very first step. Implicit bias training might take an hour. That cannot undo all the things that we heard about in the course of this afternoon, but it's a beginning. And I think at the end of the day, the main quality that one would want to encourage in a prosecutor's office is empathy. Empathy, not only for our witnesses and our victims, we're used to that, not only empathy for our police officers who have a difficult job, but empathy for the defendants and people who are caught up in the criminal justice system. A greater understanding of them and their needs will lead to much more informed and intelligent decisions by prosecutors. A second area, aside from just looking within ourselves and amongst ourselves within the office, is to look at our policies. What is it that we're doing? And often prosecutors, we're tradition bound. We have been doing things the same way for a very long time and may not have stopped to look as Jamila and Akai are doing in certain offices. And not every office will have the luxury of having them come in and rigorously look at policies, but prosecutors can do this themselves. You can look at the data, look and see what you're doing in your office. How is bail set and why and when? What are you charging? Are these charges making a difference, or are you simply just running a revolving door where people come in one day, out the other, and then back again the next day? What are your sentencing policies? Are these policies something that actually reduce recidivism? Do they make your community safer? And finally, an area where prosecutorial discretion has been shown to have a huge impact is which cases do you prosecute and why? And we have seen prosecutor offices who've just decided to stop prosecuting huge numbers of cases, unlicensed driving cases, marijuana cases, other low-level offenses. They've just said, we're not going to do this anymore. It can be handled in a different way. It could be handled as a civil summons. It could be handled in other ways. So this is where prosecutorial discretion is very powerful. It shouldn't be used lightly. Someone should look at what's going on in the office, again, much like what Jamila and Akai are doing in the pilot offices they're doing, but it can be done in any sized office. It's just a matter of taking the time to ask yourself, what are the specific things that we're doing? And finally, and I think we've been hearing this as a theme throughout the day, is to reach out to your community. This should not be a newsflash. Prosecutors do work for the people in their community. That is who hires them. Every day you stand up in court and you say, I represent the people. And so you should get to know who those people are. There's a lot of discussion about the quote unquote community. It's not one big monolithic thing, as we all know. It's many different neighborhoods, and it's useful for an office to identify what is your community and who makes up your community and who is in your community. Once you have a better sense of that, and some offices have been doing this kind of work for years, and others may be so overwhelmed with daily work that they have not been doing it as much, but it's not hard. It's very rewarding. But the first and most important thing is to listen, is to go out into your communities and meet the people that you work for and listen to them and ask them, what does public safety mean to you? What's important to you that I can help with? And again, this has been a theme that we've heard from all the speakers. It's not hard to listen to people. And it's amazing how much you will learn. And that will help you not only in unraveling unfairness in your system, but can also help you with your serious cases. Find out what you need to know and make relationships that can help you with your serious cases. Once you've done listening, you will have a better sense of what outreach you can do. And there are many prosecutors who do education programs, mentoring programs. They're in the middle schools. They have citizens academies where people come in and they teach them. They teach clergy about the criminal justice system. Some prosecutor offices have softball teams with police, great opportunity for people to know one another. Barbecues. A lot of this can be done in partnership with local businesses who are willing to help. So these are not particularly new or difficult, but I think what we've learned is that they are important. And this is not extra work. This is the work of a prosecutor who represents the people. And finally, prosecutors should get advice. We're lawyers. We know the elements of a crime. We know how to try a case. But getting advice about how to use your discretion and how to make the decisions that are effective in your community is extremely important. And so we've seen a growing number of prosecutor offices that have advisory panels. Needless to say, the prosecutor makes the final decision, but it can be helpful to meet members of your community, find the leaders in your community, and bring them in as advisors that can give you a perspective that a prosecutor may not have. So I've covered a tremendous amount of territory in a short amount of time, but I do believe that these things are doable. Most of them are not expensive. Some treatment programs could be, but we've seen a lot of diversion and things like that. But many of the things that I just mentioned could be started tomorrow. And we're facing a big issue. And the main thing is to put one foot in front of the other and just to start.